I'm calling or speaking to you rather from Melbourne in Australia. I'm a director of GTA Consultants, which is a large firm of specialist transport planners and engineers spread across Australia with offices in all the major cities. So my background is 25 years as a transport planner, engineer and modeller, and our work involves advising and working with governments across Australia at federal, state and local level, and the development industry as well, more broadly on the development of our cities and regions. And the topic that I understand we're talking to is around congestion, and in particular I'd like to talk to congestion's role in potentially building cities that work for people, and more particularly what that means in terms of congestion possibly being viewed as a planning and or a policy tool that can help drive decision making and lead to outcomes that we want for our cities. So I'm just going to walk through some topics that builds up that discussion, but the logical place I think to start is really just to make sure that everyone understands what Melbourne is and will become. It's currently a city of around 5 million people. It's expected to grow up to around 8 million people over the course of the next 20 or so years. It's growing at about 130,000 people or so each year, although that's come off recently due to COVID, but we expect it to bounce back again. So it's going to transition at some point from what on world standards would be viewed as perhaps a medium-sized city to something that's almost pressing on large city status. And so the natural question you ask yourself is, so what does that look like, feel like? How will it operate at a city of 8 million people as opposed to 5 million? Very different places. And look around the world at 5 million cities versus 8 million, and they're very different places. So we're sort of at a place or at a moment in time in Melbourne where some of the decisions we make now will affect in large part the way the city looks, particularly from a density point of view, and in large part some of those questions around congestion and how that influences what the city looks like are some of the things I'm keen to talk to today. So Melbourne is currently, if you look from a tall building in the middle of the city and look out 360 degrees, it's just a sea of low density freestanding housing dwellings. They're typically on large lots with big backyards. And the obvious question then is, if you're almost doubling the size of the population again and fitting it in the same footprint, something has to change. Something has to give in that equation. Lots of discussion centres around whether everything changes in a small way or whether change is focused on precincts around transit stations or along corridors or in urban renewal sites, or is it just an ad hoc change that's spread across the whole city? And some of those questions, I think, are influenced by the role congestion plays in how governments in particular go about making decisions and how the private sector follows that and invests and develops behind it. So what I wanted to talk about next is just congestion as a way or a dimension of looking at city planning, and in some ways as a policy tool to drive outcomes. And on that front, traditionally in Australia and in particular in Melbourne as well, congestion's been seen as bad, fundamentally bad, and to be reduced at all costs. And that's usually meant that transport policy is focused on movement, particularly movement of private cars. Now, we have become a bit more enlightened in recent years, of the last 5-10 years, and we've shifted from moving cars to moving people. So there's been a bit of an aspect of reallocating or looking at prioritising access to road space by shifting from cars to people. But it still looks at a movement function first and foremost. And in fact, when you look at the way that transport projects are justified, you often hear the tagline, it's a congestion busting project. So government media releases and taglines often have those words attached to them and often are used to justify very large capital expenditure, as if spending money simply deals with, eradicates congestion. Of course, we know that's not the way things work. But in recent times, over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen congestion and the way to look at it starting to find its way into government planning policy, I suppose you'd call it. Melbourne's Plan Melbourne, which is the strategic or the blueprint, if you like, for the city for the next sort of 20 or 30 years, has as part of its basis 20-minute neighbourhoods. And that means people being able to access a whole range of activities within a 20-minute public transport ride or walk or cycle trip. In other words, it's a bit of a return to living locally. And in large part, you ask, well, how might congestion be viewed, rather than as a macro problem across a whole city, perhaps view it as a set of more localised, not necessarily problems, but opportunities to create places that people enjoy being in their local area. And in fact, it's reframing congestion away from vehicles, in particular cars, and putting a positive spin on it and saying it's actually partly to do with gatherings of people or the range and vibrancy of activities in a place. And that's why we're starting to see a reframing of the whole discussion to be in a much more positive point of view, and congestion being seen as perhaps an opportunity that might drive a reinvigoration of a local area. So we see concepts in Melbourne around the movement in place or Lincoln Place idea, complete streets for people, all effectively variations on a theme, if you like, of how we balance the public road space, both in spatial terms but also in time. And so, and I'm sure Rob Adams will talk to that as well, but this whole idea of our public streets and roads being places for all sorts of activities to happen and for everyone to use is starting to underpin a lot of the way that planning is undertaken at a state government level. Very important change, something that's really only happened in the last 2 to 3 years in Melbourne. So if you look at what that means at a macro level for Melbourne, it's useful and helpful sometimes to look at some of the major urban renewal projects. Docklands is one that you're probably aware of in Melbourne, a huge urban redevelopment project that commenced probably 20 years ago or so. Took a long time to get started, had some major infrastructure investment to get it as catalyst projects, and typically was very large development parcels that were quite coarse and didn't have a human scale and weren't really all that good for people to spend time there other than to go to work and then go home out in the suburbs at the end of the day. But what has happened over the 20 years since is that a lot of the fine grain development has filled in the gaps, and Docklands has become a successful place. It's busy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It has a mix of uses. It's not just employment. There's parks, there's childcare centres, there's schools, there's cafes, restaurants. There's lots of people live there, don't just work there. So Docklands has become a bit of a large-scale urban renewal example for Melbourne. Even if it took a long time to see some of the positive things happening, they have happened. And so some of those lessons learned are now being applied to other large urban renewal precincts like Fisherman's Bend. Fisherman's Bend, for those that aren't aware, is a 480-hectare site. It's a very large site. It's twice the physical size and area of Melbourne CBD. At completion, it's expected to have 80,000 residents plus 80,000 jobs. So it's a very large area. And some of the things that have changed there in terms of lessons learnt and the way congestion is perhaps influencing the way some of those areas are being planned and delivered is that there's much more of a focus to deliver with an end goal in mind with Fisherman's Bend. Things are happening much sooner in the process than typically would happen. And examples of that are that the aim for Fisherman's Bend is that 80% of travel to and from the area is by public transport, walk or cycle. So that's even higher than what is achieved in Melbourne CBD. Given that that equivalent figure now for Fisherman's Bend is around about 6%, it is a wholesale change to the way a place operates. And so some of the sort of desirable outcomes or end game, if you like, for the way that an urban renewal area will work are set at the start, and a set of cascading decisions flow from that to try and achieve it. And some of those in particular revolve around how the streets are designed, getting that fine grain detail in very early, and specifically designing those public spaces so that they can do all sorts of things. You can take a delivery vehicle, you could walk or cycle down the street, you could sit in a seat outside a cafe, you could perhaps there'd be small public gathering spots in the road environment. A whole range of a different way of looking at the fine grain area within an urban renewal precinct that is actually designed to have people congestion in public spaces, and that's a marker of success. So it's almost turning congestion in some way on its head and saying we're designing for some places to be really congested from a person and an activity point of view, whereas 5 or 10 years ago that street was more likely to be designed just for people to travel along and not to stop in. It wasn't designed ever to be a destination in its own right. So that's a good outcome, I think, for as an example of how things are being done at a macro level. I suppose the good outcome of that is that it tends to then flow through via decisions at Melbourne's Planning Tribunal, VCAT, into the smaller size developments that then pop up all across the city. So examples about no car parking in a development, for example, or activated frontages, or cafes embedded within developments with seating out the front, all of those sort of very fine-grained design decisions can flow from the large-scale urban renewal through the planning tribunal and then be applied all through the suburbs. And so I think that's part of the reason why the planning system is such a key enabler in achieving the sort of outcomes we want around where congestion is and how it looks and feels. In Melbourne, one of the problems we've had for a long time, and it plays to political outcomes at state government level, is just that we do the extremes very well, but we have nothing in the middle. And what I mean by that is that in Melbourne, it's either very high density residential towers, on a scale of Manhattan, or it's freestanding suburbia. We really don't do any of that sort of medium density housing typology in the middle. And so, and the irony is that it's that medium density housing product that really is going to do the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of satisfying future population growth. So the planning system itself is the key to making that happen. So where the housing goes, what form it takes, how it can be clustered and arranged to support developing local neighbourhoods and encouraging activity, and also putting in place the sort of tribunal outcomes around no car parking in developments and a different perspective on how the public open space in the road space works and is allocated. So what does that mean? It means that the congestion levels that we currently find in busy precincts across the city are really the areas where we don't have any choice but to reinvent them using the congestion as a driver of desirable end outcomes. So that means that around a lot of the transit-oriented development in the middle suburbs, we're aiming to get this sort of vibrant place going with a mix of uses, hopefully with some employment, not just people living there. And it's really the congestion that occurs at those places that is a bit of the driver for getting more progressive medium density dwellings and housing typologies to occur in those places, if that makes sense. So congestion in that example is a marker of a problem in one respect, but it's being treated as an opportunity because you can respond to it in a way that's different to other places. But having said all that, and I suppose it's the crux of the issue, both planning and transport portfolios have traditionally been very controversial as far as state government elections go in Australia. So, and in Melbourne, a number of state government changes from one party to the other have occurred because of either too much action on transport investment or planning approvals or not enough. And so from a government point of view, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So finding the balance, and in particular finding something that works around the medium density housing equation in Melbourne is a key part of where I think the success and the future of Melbourne lie. What we find is that too much of the high density development in one place gets the bulk of the media attention, the negative media attention. And then, of course, that makes the government shy about doing the same thing in other places, particularly if they're marginal electorates, which is understandable. And they're spread throughout suburbia. And, of course, the headlines read that if you're stuck in a freeway in a car or you can't get on a train because it's full and you have to wait for the next one, that's what has contributed to previous governments being moved on. And so the role of the big transport projects is crucial in dealing with that. But what often gets left behind is the role of the smaller interventions. They typically get underdone, and what I mean by that is the more localised neighbourhood changes to the transport network. It might be priority for a public transport service, or it might be a new bus lane, or it might be a pedestrian facility, or a new cycle route, or a mix of those things, or a rejigging of the urban design in a road space. Those things spread across the network, and a light touch look at the way the network is laid out and operates can often be very, very effective. And whilst those large city shaping projects get the attention and are good for the media hit and are important in their own right and cost billions, it's really the small to medium interventions, I think, spread across the network that often give you very high bang for buck and start to create those little localised pockets of activity, vibrancy, dare I say it, congestion at the centre of those sort of 20-minute neighbourhood areas. So arguably, it's often the congestion, particularly the localised congestion, that's the driver of intervention in the first place, but can also be the marker of success at the local neighbourhood level. So I think I might leave it there and hope that is a useful contribution to the discussion and that it fits with the topic. and that it gives you a bit of a sense of what's going on in Melbourne and how that might make a contribution to your program. Thank you.